Let's go ahead and get started with this one. Why don't you give me a sense of what's in this second entry? What's important here?
Well, the importance of this date is that it is the day on which Marina Oswald appeared to testify before the commission. It was the first witness to be heard by the commission, and because of her status, it was widely publicized. And as a result, a great mass of reporters were assembled outside the VFW building in which the commission was operating. The location was just a few blocks away from the Supreme Court and had been chosen in part because of its convenience for the Chief Justice. As a result, the Chief Justice would be walking over to the building to begin the day's activities, and he was greeted by questions from the reporters. And at one point, a reporter yelled out, when will we be able to see her testimony? And the Chief Justice said, well, you certainly will, but perhaps not in your lifetime. The result of that comment was wide publication of what appeared to be a declaration by the chairman of the commission that its work, particularly the transcripts of its witnesses, might not be in the public domain for decades to come. That was, of course, not what the Chief Justice intended. He subsequently explained this to mean only that matters would be held only if there were national security interests of some kind involved, but that on the whole, all the testimony heard by the commission would be made public. The explanatory comment never caught up with the original phrase, not in your lifetime, and it prompted a more outrage, exaggerated as it may have been, in the Congress. Members immediately called for his withdrawal as chairman, or in the alternative, called for the creation of a new commission, and generally were very critical of any stated program for restricting public reports of the work of the commission. So having stepped into that controversy before he entered the building, the Chief Justice went forward to hear the testimony. There was widespread interest because, after all, here was a young woman, barely 20 years in age, who had left her family, her country, her language, to come to America with this very challenging young man who subsequently turned out to be an assassin of the President of the United States. People wanted to know, was she an agent of the Soviet Union? Why did she marry this creep? What kind of a life had they had together in Russia? What kind of a life did they have in the United States? Why had he moved from the United States to Russia, then from Russia back to the United States? Why had he tried to go to Cuba only 7 weeks before the assassination? And the questions, of course, were endless. And this first session with Maria Oswald lasted 4 days. So it began on the February the 2nd, and to the amazement of the staff, Norman Redlick, who had arranged for the questioning, was not in the room with the commission or the witness. So there was a good deal of mumbling about his exclusion, and because it had never been discussed, and it had been widely assumed that the lawyer who had prepared for the interrogation would be in there either to preside over the interrogation or basically there to assist, in this case, General Counsel Rankin in the questioning of this very critical witness. So I raised the issue initially with Rankin before the luncheon period, but then pursued it after the full days of testimony. And both Norman Redlick and I faced, I would say, probably confronted Lee Rankin at the end of the day to emphasize the fact that we did not understand why he had excluded Norman from the room. And I took the leadership in this. As I said in my journal, Mr. Redlick's personal status was involved, so I took the lead in asserting the proposition that Mr. Redlick should be in the hearing room and that the testimony should be elicited in the way in which we had planned it. I urge very strongly to Mr. Rankin that any other course of proceeding would ensure a mediocre product or record. I was extremely critical of the Chief Justice and, in a way, of course, Mr. Rankin, for not standing up more strongly to defend the course of action which he and the staff had agreed upon. In retrospect, it is surprising to me that such an important matter as the interrogation of Marina Oswald had not been discussed by Mr. Rankin with the Chief Justice more thoroughly in advance so that these problems would not develop. Whenever I stopped for breath, Mr. Redlick joined in. The result was a very devastating criticism of Mr. Rankin, which I'm sure he did not particularly enjoy, end quote. As a result, I learned, in fact, that after I went home that day, Mr. Rankin and Norman discussed the matter further, and on the following day, Norman was in the commission room to participate in the interrogation of this important witness.
You don't think that it was out of security concerns, or was it perhaps that at this point Rankin was uncertain about how things would go with this important witness? I'm just trying to get a sense of why this was decided upon in the first place.
Well, I think the conversation more or less revealed that it had not been discussed. And the Chief Justice did run a pretty tight rein over his commission members. And Rankin really had been the only non-commission member who attended commission meetings. So in the normal flow of matters, this being another meeting of the commission, I think the Chief Justice and the other members assumed that the only person present would be Mr. Rankin. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it was a deliberate decision by the Chief Justice. It was just sort of his custom of proceeding to date that led to this result. And so to that extent, and the fact that he readily agreed to having, from that point forward, the best equipped lawyers in the room with the commission, I think confirms my assessment of how it came about. From Rankin's standpoint, I thought after he reflected on it for 30 seconds, he realized that he was missing the boat in two important respects. First, the lawyers on the staff were not, shall we say, reluctant to express themselves, and indeed they wanted to be able to show off their interrogation skills by performing in front of their client, the commission. And there was no point in assembling a group of talented and well-prepared lawyers if you were not going to take advantage of their expertise and their preparation and their desire to participate fully in dealing with the commission itself, as opposed to dealing with Mr. Rankin and his supervisory colleagues. So that was an important feature, I think, that we tried to emphasize. And the second aspect of it is that without depending on the lawyers to equip themselves to handle the litigation, the full burden would fall on Mr. Rankin. And with the number of witnesses that we were contemplating for the commission, it would have been a burden that he could not fully exercise with, given all the other responsibilities that he had in supervising the staff and so forth. So I think when he recognized how important it would be to have the assistance of a well-prepared lawyer, it just confirmed the need to change the practice immediately and go on.
Yeah, a total of 94 witnesses gave testimony before the commission. That would have been a particularly difficult job for Mr. Rankin if he was handling it all by himself.
No, that's exactly right, and it would indeed, as I say, produce a mediocre a report, and that in terms would open the door to all kinds of criticism in the future.
Now, you weren't in there when Marina Oswald testified, so how quickly were you able to assess what she gave in testimony?
I heard, obviously, to some extent from Mr. Rankin, and of course I subsequently read her testimony and the testimony on her 3 subsequent appearances before the commission members or in a deposition. What was important initially was that she entered the room with the commission knowing that she had lied to the investigative agencies on 2 important points. The first was that she had not admitted early on in interrogation by the FBI that her husband had tried to kill General Walker several months before the November motorcade. And secondly, she had not volunteered or perhaps had lied about his going to Mexico in an effort to get a visa to go to Cuba and perhaps back to the Soviet Union. So she had not told the truth on that subject. She admitted that up front. She did not come into the room with a lawyer. The only relationship she had so far was with a business manager who, whether he was a lawyer or not, was not playing the role of advising her. So she was there, and she was, I'm sure, anxious and feeling particularly under pressure. But the transcripts reflect that the members of the commission were truly very gracious and sympathetic, given her youth, her situation of being so recently widowed, and when they came to a point, as I understand it, where she had to identify various personal possessions from the apartment in which Oswald was living, or from the Payne residence where she was, she burst into tears. So the members of the commission, however important they may have been in their lives, they did handle this with my sense was, with a good sense of humanity and generosity in dealing with her and trying to elicit from her, for example, reasons why she hadn't told the truth, and what were her fears, and how had she been treated by her husband, and so forth. And so some of those issues, particularly the relationship, the marital relationship, and their life together in Russia, were the subject of future inquiries. But there were immediate reactions among some members of the staff, particularly Joe Ball, I believe, when they read the interview, that she had not been cross-examined as rigorously as the situation called for. So there was, contrary to some reports that she'd been overwhelmed and intimidated and taken advantage of, the impact among some members of the staff was quite to the contrary, right. That she'd been treated too gently and without sufficient challenges to her personal integrity or to her past deception in talking to the agencies.
Let me go back to that last point, because Oliver Stone, in his film JFK, characterizes Marina Oswald's testimony to the Warren Commission, and he presents her as this scared, young, vulnerable woman who was possibly in danger of being deported or arrested, and she was, the way he describes it, she was cleaned up, given a new dress, and wheeled out on cue and basically told what to say before the commission. What do you say to that?
As with most of what Mr. Stone has said about the assassination of President Kennedy, he's clearly deliberately wrong. As I have explained, she spent 4 days before the commission on this occasion and engaged in very meaningful attention to, for example, examining things owned by her husband or by herself, or asking her to comment on notes left for her by her husband, both before the Walker attempt and subsequently with respect to his final action in assassinating President Kennedy. So She was not dressed up in any way whatsoever. She was given the opportunity to reveal herself, and I think increasingly she felt comfortable in talking more freely about the marital relationship, and commented on several occasions in a very meaningful way about the personality of the man she married and the disappointments that she had in their relationships, and the reaching out to her and appreciation of care and friendship from people like Ruth Payne and others in the Russian-speaking community.
Of the 552 people that ultimately either gave testimony or had their depositions taken or gave statements, is it no question that Marina Oswald's the most significant?
I think that's certainly right. I can think of no one who even comes close in terms of importance with respect to understanding the deceased assassin. I mean, and it was necessary to have as much understanding as possible for at least two reasons that come to mind. The first was to explore, through knowledge of his acquaintances and so forth, whether there were any leads with respect to potential co-conspirators. I mean, were there people that may have helped him get the job at the depository? Were there friends that he went drinking with that might have encouraged him to do something so drastic? And so the fullest possible knowledge of the time he spent. And just a footnote on that point, I mean, at one point she told the members of the commission, I think it was later in one of her later appearances, that while in Russia, he attended many concerts. He was a thoroughgoing commitment to sophisticated classical music. And otherwise, he learned that he was also an inveterate reader. We had information from the library books he took out. I mean, he was not an ignoramus, as a term my mother might have used under such a circumstances. He read widely. Whether the influences of that reading, I guess it would, are more challenging. But she provided information of that kind, and particularly with her lack of knowledge about his having any friends at all in the Texas situation in which he was found, and had some Cuban acquaintances in the Soviet Union. But in any event, so the pursuing her in the detail that they did was pertinent to the look for possible suggestions of conspiracy. The other major purpose is, of course, trying to explore his motive, to the possibility that could be influenced by what she had to say about him and his conduct, his attitude toward President Kennedy, whom Oswald said he respected, or his attitude toward General Walker, where he did not respect General Walker and thought killing General Walker would be a good idea. So in any event, there were these major issues that were shaped in part by what she testified to. And I think on the whole, the commission later on had to decide how to assess her with respect to her treatment in the final report.
Is there anything about the second entry that we haven't talked about yet that you want to cover?
I don't think so. I think that obviously the lawyers on the staff were pleased when he changed his rules with respect to who could participate. Right. But that's about it.
So. Okay. Well, we'll go ahead and move on to entry number 3.